time together, which we see as kind of taking two parts. The first will be a demonstration of how Dain and Constance facilitate conversations on race, utilizing the documentary Traces of the Trade. And then the second half will give us all opportunities to ask questions of them and anyone else here about, to clarify how we might go about facilitating similar conversations in our context. Just wanted to say, for those of you who are not familiar with the Society for the Increase of the Ministry, that SEM has been around since 1857. In some ways, you could say that SEM was the first leadership development organization of the Episcopal Church. And over all these years, we've made scholarships to folks who are going to seminary. And we have today among our panelists 3 of our SEM scholars, Malcolm McLaurin, Marissa Cifuentes, and Alyssa Stebbing. We're really, really glad that you're here to participate as a panelist, and it's always great to see you all. In addition to our traditional role as providing scholarships, SEM has broadened our mission to also step forward in terms of connecting people who are in leadership roles throughout the church with resources that we feel are particularly compelling and of the moment, and really can help the church make the kinds of massive strides that we feel the church really must make in order to fully live into our mission as the church in the 21st century. So we've been doing a lot of these conversations with this incredible technological tool. And today we're just particularly committed to providing a whole series of resources around what is it going to take for the Episcopal Church to really step into work that we need to do on the whole history and legacy of race in America, and particularly within our own denomination and tradition and history. And with that, I think I will also say welcome to other members of SEM's board. Constance Perry is a member of SEM's board. Hilary Greer, who's going to say a bit in a minute, is our chair. And David Hilder, who is also here as a panelist, is our treasurer. We also have some staff here, Monique Worthley and Jim Goodman, and I are kind of the everyday team of folks who run SEM. So that's who we are, and Hilary's going to say a bit more about today.
Welcome, everyone. As we were talking with Dain and Constance Perry about what they usually do, we thought it was so important to gather us together today, because we've been hearing from so many clergy who find ourselves in a moment of huge opportunity to open really important conversations. And also often not having training or practical tools in having discussions and conversations about controversial issues, which is a separate skill from being able to read and discuss a book. So we are so delighted to have the wisdom of Constance and Dain, who have been leading discussions of Traces of the Trade and the legacy of racism in the US for several years, and 450 times have traveled around showing the film and leading discussions. The way today is organized is done to give you a flavor of how the Perrys would usually lead something like this. So we're starting off with all of the panelists having already viewed the film. and starting off with a sample discussion that will only be about 30 to 40 minutes long, so that you can all see the kind of facilitation, the kind of techniques, and the approach that is modeled for us by the Perrys. Then we'll shift into a time of question and answer, where we invite your questions in the chat box. As Mike mentioned, if there's someone who would like to speak, or we need to invite someone in for more clarity, there's the opportunity to do that. We're on a webinar format today because with a panel, it would be impossible to keep track of who was supposed to be talking next if everybody's video was jarbled with everybody else's. So we're doing this to begin building a community of practice around addressing issues of race in our faith communities. And we invite you to continue to be part of us with future gatherings. So I'd like to again thank Dain and Constance Perry for being here, for diving in for the first time to do this online, and for leading us today.
Thank you very much, Hilary and Courtney. And we're grateful for the opportunity that SIM has given us to do this. So what I'd like to do is say a little bit about how we're going to proceed, and then we will just dive right in. Typically, we are gathered together in a room with a number of participants, and we introduce ourselves, and we set the context by making a couple of opening comments, just so that people have a sense of what this Traces of the Trade thing is. And we show the film, and then we come back up, and when we are in a faith community, we offer a prayer. When we're not in a faith community, in schools or corporations or a community gathering, we just invite the participants to stand in silence for a few seconds, just so that everyone can gather themselves. And then we take the people, the audience, through a process that you will see us do with the panelists that are gathered here. Let's see what else. And at the end, we offer a prayer. And again, if it's in a faith context, if not, we thank people for coming, and then we wrap up. So we will, as at the end of the 30-40 minute time that you will be going through the process as panelists and observing as people who are observing the process, we will not stop as we go through each step, because we don't want to lose the mood of the moment. But at the end, we will be happy to answer any questions about the process that we used, and have ample time to do just that. So pay attention, participants, observers, to what we're doing and how we're doing it. So I think with that, we're ready to get started.
And thank you all for participating in this. We're in a terribly challenging time in our country right now on many, many different levels. And all of a sudden, race and racism has risen very much to the top. And we have an opportunity right now to have dramatic impact on that issue that's long, long overdue. The reason I am with you here today is that I'm a direct descendant of America's foremost slave traders. My ancestors brought more kidnapped Africans to the Western Hemisphere than any other family in American history. And a cousin by the name of Katrina Brown, who you'll meet or have met, those who have seen the film on the screen, found this information out about 21, 22 years ago. And Katrina was rocked to the very bottom of her soul by what she heard, and felt she had to do something positive with that terribly negative information. And so this young woman who had never made a film before decided to make a documentary movie. And that's how Traces of the Trade came about. Traces premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2008. It was on PBS that summer. It was nominated, importantly, particularly to us in the family, was nominated for an Emmy Award for historical research, because many of you may hear history this afternoon that you are in the film that you have never heard before. And it's important that we get the untold history out, because history is so much a part of the challenge of this problem. What Katrina wanted to do was deepen the national conversation on race. We don't know how to talk about race in America. It's a muscle that we don't have, but it's a muscle that we can get. And the more often we do it, the stronger that muscle becomes and the better we get at it. A lot of people, as we travel around the country, ask us, why are you doing this? Why raise this painful topic? Let it stay under the rug. This is going to get people angry. And the person who I think has the best answer to that question is a former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Catherine Jefferts Schori, who said, once we understand the past, we can begin to understand the present, our political realities, our challenges, and our relationships. And so that's why we do this. Racism is a cancer which continues to eat away at the very soul of our country, and we don't know what to do about it. And we need to take that look in the past, learn the history, so that we can figure out how we have gotten so terribly stuck where we are today. And I'd like to add a personal note. Well, first, this is not this afternoon meant to be a time of finger pointing, of placing blame, or of feeling guilty. It's a time to take that look at the past, to listen to our own stories so that we can hear the stories of others. And I'd like to add a personal note, and that is, I don't think that this is a situation of our own making. I think it's a terrible legacy that has been handed down to us by those who came before us. And our job in our time, and our job now, right now, is to do everything that we can do to overcome this original sin of our nation.
I'd like to add a quote from a theologian and philosopher, Kierkegaard, that I think is very poignant for the conversation that we're going to move into. The quote is, "We live our life by moving forward, but we understand our life by looking back." I want to repeat that. We live our life by moving forward, but we understand our life by looking back. Those of you who saw the film had an opportunity with Dain's cousins to look back at the history of the United States with the slave trade. We believe that the legacy of that is racism that we are living with today. And proof positive of what we have been all experiencing during the past several weeks. In order to understand why we are where we are today in 2020, we believe that we need to look back at the history to better understand that history, to be truthful about the history, and understand its connection to today. That's why we do what we do. And that's why, as Dain said in his opening comments, that Katrina wanted to develop and produce the film. So we now are going to invite the panelists in your chat box to write a word, and I'll say more about that in a moment. You have viewed the film, and the film, no doubt, has brought up a lot of emotions. As Dain said, there's a lot of history in the film, and we will want to be able to talk about it. But for the time that we're going to be gathered, we want you to be in your heart and in your feelings, because the sin of racism affects all of us, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of how long you have been in this country, regardless how long you have been here. And so it affects us emotionally. And so we invite you now, those of you who are on the panel, to please write one feeling word, not 2 or 3, not a sentence. You'll have an opportunity to say more in a moment, but write one feeling word that comes the closest to expressing what is in your heart as you take yourself back into what you were feeling as you were viewing the film Traces of the Trade. What one feeling the most resonates with you? And when you are ready, please write that one word in the chat box.
Dain, you're muted.
We're whispering to each other. Okay, why don't you go with that?
Okay. What we would like to do is to share with everyone gathered the feeling words that the panelists shared. Shattered, conflicted, grief, sad, heartbroken, sickened, guilt. And there may be others, and we will make sure that we will capture them. And there'll be an opportunity, if I didn't catch your feeling word, there'll be an opportunity as we unpack what you said for me to capture them. Dain and I keep a log of all of the screenings that we have done with the feeling words and the stories that people say. This is one way that we use to honor these conversations that we consider to be sacred conversations, whether we're in a faith community or not. Before we invite those on the panel to say a little bit more about the feeling word that they used, we would like to offer a prayer. Almighty God, creator of us all, you who made each and every one of us in your image, grant us the grace, wisdom, courage, strength, and perseverance to work for racial justice and to have neither patience with nor tolerance of any kind toward any of your people. May the Holy Spirit so move our minds and our hearts that we truly may live into the racial justice, peace, and reconciliation, respecting the dignity of every human being, which you so yearn for all of your people. We pray for the souls of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and all those whose lives we have learned about, and all those lives that we have not learned about. We offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, so panelists, we will invite you to raise your hand. We will call on you. And we ask that you share the one feeling word that you called out, and then just say a little bit about why you used the word that you used. Is there something in the film that triggered it for you? Did it remind you of something in your life as you think about your own life? Did it remind you of the events of the past several weeks in our country that, coupled with the film, has brought up for you? Whatever your stories are, whatever they are, in this sacred space, we invite you to share. There are no stories or feelings that are inappropriate for this conversation. It is whatever is in your heart. We must learn to be able to have conversations like this.
And at this juncture, and this is a little instruction, we say that this is not a debate. A person's feeling is not up for debate. It is their feeling. And we need to respect that feeling and honor that feeling. And so we ask all of the audience to listen, not just with your ears, but listen with your heart. Do what we call sacred listening, of truly, truly hearing the words and what is being said and the meaning behind those words.
So, what is your feeling word? Why did you use it? What's your story?
Bob?
You're on mute, Bob.
Sure. Just to get things started, I actually wrote childhood before I realized it should be a feeling word, but body slammed. Going back into my childhood, I grew up 2 towns down the bay from Bristol, Barrington, Rhode Island. As a 10-year-old, I would sit on the bluffs looking out over the Providence River, and I would imagine the arson of the gas bay, the burning down of the gas bay, which was the first protest to the revolutionaries. And I was all on their side, of course. John Brown, by the way, was one of those people that did that. Anyway, Narragansett Bay is just deep in my soul. It's when I need to go someplace, I go in my imagination in Narragansett Bay. But I watch Traces of the Trade, and I cannot see that bay now as disembodied from the slave trade. So what was for me in my head and then coming down to my heart has just gone all the way down into my body now. And that's what I'm feeling with the recent events. We've got to get out of our heads, down in we have to know stuff intellectually, but then we have to get down into our hearts, and then we have to keep on going down to where we feel the bodily pain. And so in the film, when the manacles were shown, or when you went to the door of no return, and you could feel it in your body.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Bob, you'll be interested to know that Bristol, a town that has been quite resistant to Traces of the Trade, we have shown it there a couple of times, but it's been pretty resistant. their their town council 2 nights ago voted to fly a Black Lives Matters flag from the top of Town Hall. A remarkable move on part of that town. And it shows what's going on today, the opportunity we have today if we have the courage to grasp it.
Thank you.
And when you are speaking, you might have noticed my head was down. And I am not putting ascribing names when people are sharing their stories, but I am jotting down your feeling word and the stories that you shared. And Bob, if I might say that some time ago, I said to Dain, you know, what we did in the 60s with civil rights, passing civil rights and voting rights and housing rights, fair housing rights, that was all important work. We needed to do that work. But what we didn't do is we didn't do the work of changing hearts and minds. And that, not that the passing public policies that will help undo and dismantle racism, but we also must do the work of our hearts. We must be able to connect to each other as human beings. So thank you. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
What was your feeling word and why did you use it? What's your story?
Anyone who feels comfortable to go next.
Holly?
Yeah, Holly.
So the word that I used was anxious. So I felt anxious throughout the entire movie because I just didn't know what was going to happen. And I looked at your family, you know, so proper, genteel, polite. And I thought, how are you going to conduct yourselves? How are you going to talk and communicate, you know, when you went to Africa, you know, with those folks? And I just was this feeling of how do we have that conversation without saying something unintentionally so insulting?
Thank you.
Thank you. What was your feeling word and why did you use it? What's your story? What's your memory?
Let's ask Alyssa to share, please.
A lot of what Bob was saying sparked a lot of memories. So I was a child of civil rights activists in the 60s and 70s and in Southeast Texas. And so my word was gutted. You didn't, I don't think you saw that, but my word is gutted because there was a lot of physical reality for me in watching the film and connecting to the past, because as a young child, I was in the midst of the fires and the violence and the protests. My parents decided to go to a church where the pastor was married to a Black woman, which caused Beaumont, Texas to just kind of erupt. And our house was bombed on Easter Sunday with the gas drag bomb, which didn't blow up the house. It just put a hole in the floor. It didn't go off like it was supposed to, which caused my parents to remove us from the South and move. Both my parents' families were from Texas, but we left. Not only did we leave the South, we left the church. My father felt called to be a Southern Baptist minister, but saw that the church was not only complicit, but participating in the violence towards other people. the Blacks and African Americans in our town. And so I wasn't raised in the church because of that. Later, my father returned to his call later in when I was a teenager. But so I have these memories. Even when we left for Kansas, then Kansas University was blowing up too, and we were being stopped by the National Guard and all of that. So I have all these childhood memories of fear. So I have that gutted feeling when the movie took us back to the history, and you mentioned the manifold or whatever they were chaining people with, and you were walking around the plantations. And I was raised poor as well, and I see those plantations as some other place that I don't understand, that is genteel, someone used that word, and yet I had this fear of it, and I never knew why. I feared tourists because then I was raised in the Navajo reservation, and the only white kid in school, and I was raised around this fear, and yet being a white girl, I was still not as touched by it as my friends were. So I guess I say gutted because when you connect all the dots for me now as an adult, and I understand more of what that fear was, then I feel gutted.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. What was yes, Malcolm?
The word I chose was tired. And I chose tired not because I'm glad we have these conversations, and I think it's very important for us to have these conversations. And I feel called to be a part of these conversations. But tired because these conversations take a toll on Black and brown people and people of color. That these conversations, whether we feel called to be a part of them or not, they take a toll. And usually it happens once or twice a year when, some big event or around MLK Day or whatnot. But in the past 2 weeks, there has been, there's no escape from the conversation. Not that I could, it's everywhere. You turn on the TV, wherever you go, these conversations are happening. It's good that they're happening. And I'm anxious and excited about how the Episcopal Church can live into its best self and being a part of the answer, the solution, the roadmap to racial healing.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you.
Thank you. What was your feeling word, and why did you use it?
Perhaps we can call on Leah. I see her hand is raised in the window there.
We're not seeing that.
Thanks. My word was heartbroken. And it just really, I love that word that Alyssa used, gutted, because it really stabbed me when one member of your family said, I call nonsense on this, used a different word, that they knew what they were doing was evil and they did it anyway. And that really just slapped me in the face. And looking at those headstones of 2 children who were purchased as a gift for his wife, I can't imagine, like, I can't wrap my head around or my heart around anyone doing that. And having such disregard for another human being or a mother. Those children had a mother. And the other piece that got to me was showing the Episcopal Church, I believe it was in Bristol, and that the stained glass was purchased by the DeWolfs. So it, it was just kind of all encompassing. And I thought, how much of a blind eye did we all turn? And that just breaks my heart.
Thank you, Leah. Monique, I understand you had your hand up.
Yes, yes. My word was safety, and I can't thank you both enough. I found the film to be remarkable and honest and forthright. One of the parts in the film that really hit me was knowing that the church was right above the dungeon. And just the sense of being so vulnerable because of who I am. And knowing that my children are just as vulnerable. And just to share with everyone, I was on a platform the other day, one of the media platforms, and it struck me because it again instilled a lot of fear. There was not a National Guard, but one of the Army military men, young Black man. And the protesters were chanting, "I'm proud to be Black." And he had on his helmet, and it was down, and he was mimicking what they were saying. And I said to myself, well, I hope he's not caught. So this film was, I was going to watch it again today, and I said, no, I need to take a step back before I watch it again. But I thank you both.
Thank you, Monique. Thank you. David?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. So my word was horrifying. And I meant that because it was, to me, horrifying to think that educated people who believed that they were religious could think it was acceptable, that it was okay, that it was not wrong to buy, own, and sell people. That is the core truth that came to me from the film. And in fact, I also thought very much about the example of, I believe it was James DeWolf purchasing 2 slaves as gifts for his wife, and that they were buried in the family estate, graveyard. Again, just horrific to think that anyone could think that that was all right, that that was acceptable, that that was behavior. Obviously, this brings up many other thoughts. I think of this in terms of both personal and political. I've always tried to conduct myself in an honorable and non-racist, non-racial way through everything that I've done personally and professionally. But the political dimension is deeply disappointing, as Constance has pointed out. I've been thinking, I was alive. I may not have taught myself to read at age 4, but I was reading in 1968. And I was very politically conscious in 1968. And in 1968, I thought that the progress that had been made in civil rights, voting rights, and equality from 1954 to 1968 would have created a very different outcome by 2020 than it has. And that's deeply disappointing. And I think, again, Dain, I think you said it beautifully. Slavery was the original sin of American democracy, and it's now up to us to figure out what we can do to improve the world we've inherited against both those dimensions, both personal and political.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you, David. Thank you.
I'm going to, I'm not going to get the first part of this quote right at all. But the last part is, and for good people to do nothing, you know, that good people, if we don't speak up, if we don't speak out, if we don't learn the history, if we don't take action, it's the good people, the well-intentioned people who can help create an environment that perpetuates this. The other thing is many people, David, not just people who are white, after 1968, civil rights, wonderful work done. People had marched, people died. And we're patting ourselves on the back. If you read John Lewis's book, he talks about that. And he said, we all then went back to our homes. We all went back to our lives. We all went back to school, things that they had put on hold. And we thought, we've done it. We've done it. And all of us we've taken our eyes off the ball.
And three of you have talked about the church and the church's role. Let me underscore that. It wasn't until about the 1850s that the Episcopal Church started truly speaking out against slavery. There were a few priests who did, but not many. Most supported slavery in the pulpit by quoting the Bible. And the dioceses of Virginia and Georgia both owned plantations. So the complicity of the Episcopal Church, Episcopalians, studies have shown, owned slaves in much greater numbers than any of the other Protestant denominations. So we were terribly complicit. And now we're working very, very hard to be part of the solution.
Presiding Bishop.
Sara, you had your hand up, I think. Is that right?
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah. I also see Hilary does also. Yeah, so the word that I had was grief, and I have to admit I was struggling between, I was torn between grief and gratitude. You know, the story that I was taught about my family and my faith was very positive. I was given a very, we could say, whitewashed version of history. And my ancestors were held up as heroes in American history. And it wasn't until my own engagement with I would say particularly with young Black ministers and people from indigenous communities here in the US, that I came to do my own research and look at my own history differently and find that my ancestors, the Wolcotts in Connecticut, bought and owned the first slave, the first slave in Connecticut, which would have been the 1670s or thereabouts. And his name was Felix. And And it was I remember the day I found out, I was also hanging out with some of my Black friends in seminary. And I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say, if anything at all. And it took a while to kind of begin to talk about it. And I had wanted to go to Ghana, and I've never been able to go to Ghana and to see those places where the slaves were held. And what really struck me in this, and maybe it's because I work a fair amount with other families and faith communities around these questions. And part of what struck me so much was the grief, not just in what was the pain that was experienced, but in the lies my family told, generations upon generations upon generations, that my grandparents and parents, I really don't think they remembered. Like, I really think that they dismembered that part of their history. And we were always told it's the Southerners, right? It's like there was something about the white folks down South. That was a problem in America. It wasn't the Northerners. It wasn't, I'm from California. My family's been here for several generations and in California. It was always the South's fault. And that unwillingness to take responsibility, to take ownership, to look yourself in the face and to see that ancestor looking back at you. Like that, the unwillingness to see that image in the mirror. And I have had so many emotions towards my own ancestors, so many emotions. But I think the grief is also like, do we have the rituals now? Do we have the healing rituals, the embodied somatic musical healing rituals? And I have a little bit of despair around that answer to that question.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you. Marissa?
Thanks. The word that I used was conflicted. And I can say conflicted while watching the film because I have never had the luxury of not thinking about these things. I've never had the luxury of being able to look objectively at the issue of racism in this country, because that is part of my story of who I am as a girl with brown skin. But still, I've always, still, I've worked to educate myself, and I've been to West Africa, I've been to Cuba, I've seen a number of the places, trying to make sense of how humans can treat other humans. And as I watched the movie, glad to have the platform to bring people a better understanding about things. But the conflict comes in because I remain particularly interested in not what happened, but how we might further live into our baptismal covenant now. And particularly in the time that we find ourselves, what is it that continues to prevent us from doing so?
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to have to wrap up this portion, but there's something I want to say before we do. Several of you have talked about the history. And one of my great learnings in the 19 years that Constance and I have been doing this, and particularly in sharing my life with her, is that we white folks don't know what we don't know. And until we learn what we don't know about the experiences of particularly African Americans, but any people of color, we're not going to be able to move through and succeed at as Marissa just said, living into our baptismal covenant. And one of the critical things is the history. The history we have not been taught, but the history that every African American knows, that gives them pain, that gives them anguish, that gives them fear, that they know and we do not. And as a result, we don't understand where that pain and anguish and fear are coming from. A few very, very quick examples. We've heard in the news the last few days that something is going to happen in Tulsa next week. Tulsa, 99 years ago, the white population descended on a section of Tulsa known as Greenwood. That was the Black section of Tulsa. And it was considered the Wall Street of Black America. It was so successful. And the white population descended on Greenwood, literally burned the entire area down and killed hundreds of African Americans. There are stories like that, and I won't go into them right now because we don't have the time, but simply Google massacres of Blacks in America, and you will see lists of them. Wilmington, Delaware, Memphis, Rosewood, Florida, New Orleans, all for no reason at all. Blacks know this history. We don't. The fact that the GI Bill was written intentionally in a way so that it would be administered locally and Black people could be not excluded from the benefits of the GI Bill. As a result, most of the Black GIs did not receive money to start a new business, money to buy a home, money to go to college, all of those things that are wealth building things. Imagine what America would be like today if the Black GIs had had equal opportunity to get those GI funds. We'd have a different country today. So learn the history, read books that have been written by Black authors, to hear their pain so you can experience as best as we white folks can their pain.
We thank all of the panelists for sharing your stories. And we will move on, Hilary. So if you want to. Reluctantly.
Yeah, so thank you again to all of the panelists. It's not a small thing to be asked to watch the film and then show up and share your emotions and your stories in front of an audience you can't see. So thank you very much for doing this. I'd like to invite everyone who's on the webinar now to use the chat box. First, to just enter, what did you notice about this conversation, and in particular, how Dain and Constance led it? And what are some of your questions about that? And as you enter those, I'm gonna highlight two things that I noticed and that Dain and Constance have shared in prior conversation. The first was the real honesty and vulnerability of the conversation, which I have not really experienced before in conversations about race and racism. And the second, which I'd like to ask them to talk more about, I think that's because when they do this, they very consciously base the conversation in emotion and personal story. Can you talk a bit more about that, Dain and Constance, how you do that and why you do that?
That's where the work is that has to be done. The work Yeah, there's some work that has to be done up here in the head, but it's the changing of hearts, the changing of hearts. And that is done through the head, yes, but it's getting in touch with our feelings and getting in touch with experience. It's not unusual to have people in tears during these conversations after the film. It's not unusual to have someone be in the middle of telling their story and all of a sudden look around and say, I've never said this to anyone in my life, not even my spouse. So that's the work that we have to do. And by getting it out, by talking about it and hearing it from others, we hear Black people say, I've never heard white people talk like this before. The lament that we hear from white people. And we hear white people say, we've never heard stories like this from people of color. And not just Black people, but people of color, because it happens to all people of color. And it's through sharing those stories and getting into the heart that what
I think it is difficult to move to solutions if we don't know each other's stories. And if each of us has not spent time being in touch, and I would say people who are white, African Americans are in touch with this. I need to get my glasses so I can see. Let's see. No, Marissa. When Marissa was talking, we live this 24 hours a day. We live this every second of every minute of every hour of every day, right? People who are white can pay attention if they want to, but if they don't, they don't. And so if we begin into figuring out what to do without being able to talk about our sharing our stories, getting to know each other and build trust and build relationships, we're talking across each other. We're talking at each other and not to and with each other. So it's a very important part of the process. We need to move to doing, but we also need to begin, we believe, with hearts and humanity.
And the immediate instinct of most white people is, how do I fix it? I want to go fix it. And we can't do that. We've got the internal work we have to do first. And we have to get in touch, and this is extremely challenging. We have to get in touch with our whiteness and what that means, the advantages that are given to us simply by the fact that I look like this. The rapper Ice-T said, my sin is my skin. And that's the bottom line of the story. That's the bottom line of it. He can't zip that skin off.
So thank you. There are a few comments, and I think what you were mentioning is in part answered to Susan Ridgway's comment, where she says, how do we change individuals so that they don't keep perpetrating white supremacy in their offspring? And what I hear from you is the importance of all doing our own work and knowing each other and developing relationships and going into the story part of that, and realizing that for all of us who are white, we are part of upholding the system of white supremacy, whether we agree with it or not. That the nature of sin is that it entangles all of us.
Yeah.
And that making sure that our educational system is telling the truth. Mm-hmm. So becoming involved in policy making and making sure that our textbooks are honest rather than painting a picture that is dishonest. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. The textbook I had on South Carolina history back in the early 50s was a pack of lies. It was extraordinary, the dishonesty that was projected in that book. And people grew up with that misinformation. And so our educational system needs to be impacted.
And I believe, Dain and Constance, that you have a list of resources that are going to be included in an email that we're sending out after this, so that if people are looking for their top picks of what to look at for knowing a bit of the history, we're able to learn. We have a few other comments. Richard Vinson is saying hello from meeting you 10 years ago at the cathedral in Honolulu, and notes that he wrote that night, "I have a profound feeling that everything changes now, and yet a decade later, we are still where we are."
And absolutely, because we haven't done the work. We haven't done the work. We haven't educated ourselves. We haven't listened.
The work is hard. There will be strong pushback, very strong pushback. It's going to be threatening to a lot of people. A lot of white people feel that they have to give something up in order to give equality to everyone, equal opportunity to everyone. Nothing has to be given up. We just have to treat people the same. There's no surrender here. There's no surrender here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a few different questions. There are comments, and we invite you to continue the dialogue with each other in the chat box. A few of the questions we have, is this a model, what we just did here today, a model of discussion you would recommend for other conversations around racism? And if so, are there resources about this approach that can help me learn how best to do it?
No, do you want to start? And I can...
While Constance is thinking of a good answer, it can be used for any difficult conversation. Getting people into their feelings rather than staying in their head. It can work with any conversation, with any difficult conversation. So absolutely.
We have been, just in the past week, we've received 9 reach outs from people from around the country asking if we could do some kind of traces of the trade like we're doing today, or if we could facilitate conversations with a book group. And so we said yes. And so when we are in front of working with people who are reading a particular book, and they want to be able to move forward and have a better understanding, we will use the exact same process. We will begin by inviting people to share feelings and share stories. Again, we can't get to problem solving if we're not coming from the same basic place, and if we haven't built trust, because we'll be viewing the problem differently. We have to get on the same page. And that doesn't mean we need to agree, but we have to have the same basic understanding. Facts, data, history matter.
And the technique that we use is one that we have cobbled together over time. Yeah. The feeling words, we saw a facilitator do that once. And we both looked at each other and said, holy smoke, that's the secret of getting that feeling word out. And the magic of the feeling word is a lot of people in the audience who typically would not say anything, if they have an opportunity to anonymously call out their feeling word, they have become part of the conversation and they may want to talk about it. So it gets people who typically may not say anything the opportunity to. And another thing that we do almost invariably is right before we end, if the conversation has slowed down a bit, we say, okay, we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. We've got time for one or two more. And we know you're out there in the audience. We don't want you to get home and say as you walk up the stairs, I wish I had said that while I was there. So this is your opportunity. Invariably, someone will raise their hand at that point. So that unsubtle invitation will get people to speak.
So I think that gets to two questions that Franca Floro has asked. One, do you find that people need help understanding feeling word?
No.
They get it?
No. We, after almost 500 times, no. Because again, if you watch what we did, what I did during that part, we acknowledge that there is a lot of history in the film. And we say, we hope that you will reflect on that history, share what you have learned.
Later.
But later, for the time that we are gathered, we are going to focus on the emotion, the feelings that surfaced for you as you view the film and you think about your own life and your own stories. And so we invite you to share one feeling word. You may have a whole lot that you want that are surfacing. And this is not in your head. This is not, I will say, I think, but I feel. And absolutely not. No, at least up to this point, I hope we're not jinxed, but absolutely not.
Yet I will disagree with her.
Oh.
Some of the feeling word, some of the words that people use are indeed not feeling words, but they're words that help move the conversation forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah, and Marissa has noted that there are other communication models as well that are well suited to this. She's mentioning circle process. I would commend the work of Visions and the books written by Bill Kondrath, particularly Facing Feelings in Faith Communities, where he looks at how to build emotional literacy and have feeling-based conversations within congregations as well. Franca also had a second question, which was, what is your encouragement to those who may not have the same level of credibility or authority that you both have to lead and hold this kind of sensitive and complex conversation?
We're not trained in this. We don't take a class or go to school. Literally. When was the film? In 2000?
2001, we took the trip to Bristol in Africa and Cuba. In 2002, I showed it for the first time, a 20-minute trailer.
Black and white trailer.
to a group of African-American kids and Latino kids, summer group at our church in Boston. And I was scared to death. I had no qualification for doing this. And we've struggled. It's because we've done this so often. It may look smooth, but it's only because we've done it so many times.
The first time, oh, did we lose them?
Oh gosh.
Don't you hate when that happens?
Yes.
Oh my word.
So the first time Dain showed the documentary, as he said, he went by himself to this small group of inner city youth who were mostly youth of color. And he came home, told me about the conversation, and I thought, okay. And he said, well, why don't you come with me? So the next time he gathered, I went with him, and I heard him, he was fielding questions, and afterwards Dain said, how do you think it went? And I said, well, you know,
that was pretty bad.
This isn't about you, really. What if you use the film as a way to engage people and invite them to share feelings and stories? And so the process that we use is a process that evolved over time. And we have no pride of ownership here. Please use it. And as several of you have said, there are other ways to engage people in the conversation. This seems to work for us, for what we do.
Yeah. Jenny Anderson had
Hi, Jenny.
and some questions. She says, this has invited me to think differently with a deeper understanding and to know better the mystery around what I thought I knew. My question is, how might we take care of ourselves and stay in community to care for each other through this vulnerability? And does Traces, or will you, offer ways of having future safe places for conversations?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things, I'll speak to the first part of it, Jenny's question. And one of the things that Dain and I, several years ago, hoped that we would be able to do, because we've traveled around and screened the film in so many places, we have met amazing people who have participated in those conversations. And the conversations are amazing because of the people in the room, and who have said that they want to continue the work. And Dain and I had our wish, our hope, our dream is, if there could have been a way, if we had lots of money, we would have wanted to find a way to gather people from around the country who have been doing this work, maybe 2 or 3 people representing from the church, to a location over a weekend, to share what it is that they're doing, the challenges that they're facing, offer pointers to each other. Well, it's just the 2 of us doing this, right? And so, and we don't have those resources. But if there is a way that we can, and perhaps now we've discovered this Zoom. And so perhaps there might be ways that we can use technology to create space for people who want to continue the conversation, people who really want to roll up their sleeves and do the work, to share amongst ourselves, as well as to create a support system for each other. This is hard work. This is lonely work. This is difficult work, and no one has the answer. But maybe together we could form a community of support for each other.
That this started off as a family endeavor, and with very, very, well, no money behind it. The money had to be raised, and it took 8 years to do that. And so we're far from being a sophisticated operation. Some of the cousins are still involved, doing things that they feel they're called to do. This is what we feel is our calling. And Jenny, we wish we could say yes. There's a way that we can create a safe space, but unfortunately not.
Yeah, I will say Sim has been working on creating community of practice around the agrarian ministry. And one of the things we've just started talking about is doing that around people who are devoted to anti-racist work, and in particular to practical changes in our communities of faith and our denominations. So we do plan to continue offering more to gather people. We're trying to move to meeting formats so that everybody who's on can see each other and start to develop relationships with each other. Today, we couldn't really do that because of the panel setup, which would have been very confusing on Zoom, in Zoom meeting. But please stay tuned. Mike will be sending out 2 emails after this with resources, and they will also include contact information for Constance and Dain. We're going to be talking about doing some screenings. We're also experimenting with, do people want to log in, watch the film together, and then have the discussion immediately afterwards, or just hosting these conversations. So we welcome your thoughts, your feedback, your hopes of what you would like to see that would be useful to you. And Jenny also had a wonderful sort of question and point, which was, perhaps our churches can find a way to have and hold our hearts. Yes. And what could that look like?
Hilary, I'd like to toss something in here in case someone doesn't ask the question. And that is, we encourage churches to not only do the screening for their congregation, but invite the community in. It's critical to go beyond your walls and create a community conversation if there isn't already one going on. And if you do a screening or any kind of event like this, have a sign-up sheet for people who are interested, and have a date set 2 or 3 weeks out for a regathering of that group so that you can start building momentum and building an organization. That's all basic community organizing. But a lot of that doesn't come naturally to priests. My father was one, I know from where I speak. And it works well if to help create something going, or using this can be a terrific way to re-energize a group that has been working on race and has begun to peter out a little bit.
Thank you.
It's okay if only 5 people sign up.
Yeah.
It's okay. You begin with 5 and you build from there.
Yeah.
And one of the another sort of that's tied to this, sometimes we're asked, well, how, my parish is predominantly or all white. What can I do? Well, there's a lot of work that you can do. We've been talking a lot about sort of being introspective, self-examining, that kind of thing. But the more people of color in your community begin to see that St. Anne's, I'm making this up, I don't know if there's a St. Anne's in the group here today, but St. Anne's has been meeting and they've been having these conversations and they have been involved and they're doing things, the word will get out. It will get out in the African American community and communities of color. What we need to see is that you're in it for the long haul, not just when there is a crisis. I'm not sure who might have mentioned that, but not just when there is a crisis after 3 weeks or a month and the spotlight is over and then we all get back into our work. People need to see that you are in this for the long haul. It took 401 years to get where we are. It is not going to change overnight.
But please don't immediately rush out and reach out to that African American church that you've been meaning to reach out to for the last 7 years, but haven't done it. Wait until you do your own internal work so that if and when you do that reach out, it is meaningful and it will work. The last thing that we need to have happen is force feeding the system and inviting a Black church to become involved in, let's have a discussion on race. Well, no, have a relationship first. Have a Bible study with them. Have breakfast to lunch with their pastor every month for a year to develop a relationship, then start talking about what you can do.
Thank you. We have several questions and comments that have come in. I will say it's 3:24 now. We'll officially end at 3:30, but we'll continue. Constance and Dain have agreed to continue beyond that for anyone else who wants to stay for question and answer. So maybe we'll give this, actually it's 3:25, we'll give this as a breaking point. If you need to log off and you want to go because this is the time you have scheduled to be with us, thank you for being with us. And special, tremendous thanks to Constance and Dain Perry for leading us in this conversation, and for all of our panelists for being here and for helping to model what a conversation like this can look like. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Then, yeah, as I'll continue to go through the questions until it looks like we're petering out.
And can we release panelists if they
Oh,
need?
yes, please, panelists, feel free. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Courtney.
Feel free to stay or to go. Grayson Robinson wrote in for Suzanne saying, what shocked me in the film was when the Africans were being prepared for transit, they were baptized and made to renounce their given names in Ghana, and in baptism receive a new name to become a slave of God. Our Episcopal Church needs a liturgical and sacramental confession of its complicity in further enslaving Africans by making them give up their birth name. And she has a couple of other thoughts, but what is, I know there have been movements towards confession, and can you talk a bit about that and what you would like to see or hope to see?
We have had services of healing and repentance, healing and reconciliation, and those were largely focused on, that came out of the resolution that came out of General Convention in 2006 that called on the Episcopal Church parishes to do a study of the history of the legacy of slavery, and if they were in a part of the country that where there was a large indigenous population, or mostly Latino, that they would include that in that study, and then and share the results of the study within their parish, have conversation, and over time, and then in fact have a service of repentance and healing and reconciliation. I am not aware of any such service that deals specifically or has dealt specifically with the with name, culture being stolen from that, but that can be included in a litany. Absolutely. We did a screening recently when we could travel back in the old days of January and February and March, and there was an African man who said he did not realize, there was a lot of history that he didn't know. And when he learned that his name, I'm making the name up, Arthur, was given to him, by people who were white, and it was not at all connected to his heritage, he stopped being called Arthur and he changed his name, because that was his way of trying to connect with his ancestry.
And we encourage parishes and particularly dioceses to have services of repentance. Several have done it over the years, and some have done it very well. Some have done it very poorly, what I call repentance light. We think that the best way to do it is do the work in the diocese or do the work in the parish of examining the history, discussing the history, but also going beyond that, having screenings of traces or other films, having book studies so that people are really, really understanding what it is the repentance is truly about. And then it can have great, great meaning. The best one we've seen, and we have not seen them all, was the Diocese of Western North Carolina, where they spent 1.5 years preparing for the service. They took oral histories at parishes, did all sorts of things. And when they had the service, they had it in the biggest church in the diocese, and they hoped they might have 250 to 300 people there. 700 people showed up. And so if it's done right, it can be done well.
Yeah, and that may be an idea for a future webinar as well, to talk to people who've engaged this work. Judith Ain had 2 questions as well. First is the easiest. In future events, would it be okay to invite some Baha'i friends who are deeply concerned about these issues? Absolutely. We are speaking from our own sort of Episcopal Christian context, and I was excited to see on this call we had some Jewish colleagues and people from a variety of denominations. So we would love people to invite your friends, whatever their background, to be part of this conversation.
We have screened the film for many, many different denominations. We screened it at the Parliament of World Religions in Melbourne, Australia, where every denomination and faith on the face of the earth practically was represented there. And it resonates with any of them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Judith also writes, there are a lot of other types of oppression that can be brought up by the film. How do you handle the awareness of these other forms of oppression as they are raised in these conversations?
We acknowledge them, we name them, and because we're focused on the racism, we believe that racism exists in all other forms of oppression as well. And so that is the focal point for the work and conversation that we do, so that there are people who will talk about modern day slavery. There are people who talk about issues around gender, sexual orientation, and we acknowledge that those isms exist. And we think the granddaddy, the one that encompasses all of them, is racism. And so we want to make sure that we keep that as our primary focus in what we do.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We also had a question from Sara about how are you, or maybe others, educating current and future generations in your own family about this history?
Well, while Dain is thinking, so we, one of our family members who has grandchildren, school age, and about to be 3 years old, so 3 and up to maybe 12, and said, how do I have this conversation with my grandchildren? What books are out there? And so we made some go online, Google.
Yeah, our recommendation was Google.
Yeah, and go online. And so they have ordered a couple of books that they are going to read first and see whether or not it makes sense for their children given the age category that they're in. We have begun to put together a list of books ourselves for how people can do that. But there are two places that I want to refer Sara to. One is Time Magazine or Newsweek did an article a few years back, and the article was titled, "Is My Baby Racist?"
In September. Ooh.
Is my baby racist? Dain is trying to remember the date, but if you Google Newsweek article, "Is my baby racist?" it will come up. And what you will learn is that even at age 3, children begin to form impressions, feelings. They may not be able to articulate them, but you can begin to educate your children in some ways, even as young as 3 years old. The important thing is that we've got to find, one of the challenges that comes out of that article is that parents have a hard time with the conversation because they haven't dealt with the topic. They are uncomfortable bringing up the issue. And so they don't feel at all prepared to engage in a conversation with their children. So while I would say, while parents are trying to figure out how to educate their children, they can also, in tandem, maybe a step ahead of their children, be able to educate themselves and become more comfortable themselves about having that conversation.
And simply telling the truth, telling the true history, talking about it, and not from a perspective of deep, deep guilt, but rather, this is the reality, this is what happened, it was awful, we can't let it happen again. And then bringing our Christian faith into the conversation and our baptismal covenant into the conversation.
And our final question will be the one from Holly, which is there anything that you would do differently now during your trip to Ghana, given your growth?
I wouldn't want to. I would want to go through the shock and the pain and the truth finding. That's critically important to the process of learning. That's a very, very interesting question, Holly. I would not want to have gone there for the first time in the place that I'm in now, because I had to go through a process of learning and the emotion of getting in touch with what actually happened there, and knowing that my ancestors, I was walking where my ancestors had walked, I sat in rooms where they sat. And as my brother Jim said, James DeWolf may well have been negotiating in this room that we're in right now. And I know I went places that they did not. I can't imagine they would have gone down to those dungeons or to the door of no return. And that's a deeply, deeply emotional, heart-rending experience.
Thank you. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. And to Dain, thanks to Dain and Perry and Constance Perry for bringing us all together and for opening this. We very intentionally titled this session Opening Conversations. And this is our first of these such conversations, and we'll be working together to offer more. We also have 2 webinars that are already in the works. We've been doing sessions to bring people together around food justice and food growing ministries. And we have 2 that are being planned to look specifically at the intersection of racial justice and food justice in this country. So you'll be getting more information about that as well in the emails that Mike will be sending you. And we invite you to reach out to let us know what would be useful and helpful for you. And we hope to see you again, really see each other again online soon. So thank you very much. And thank you, Dain and Constance, so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is